The pencil moved in small, unhurried arcs. The sound of it, if anyone had been listening closely enough, would have been almost nothing, a soft friction against paper, barely audible beneath the low conversation and the music that a bar on Polk Street in San Francisco kept at a level designed to fill the room without dominating it. The year was 1974. The man holding the pencil was young, and he had been sitting in that bar for some time, and on the table in front of him a sketch pad lay open, and on the sketch pad a face was slowly becoming recognizable. This is where the case that would come to be known as the Doodler begins, not with a discovery, not with an investigation, not with a name released to the press, but with this particular action, repeated across bars and diners in the western part of San Francisco over a period of months. A young man drawing a portrait of someone he had just met, rendering that person's face with enough skill and enough care that the drawing itself became a reason to stay, a reason to keep talking, a reason not to leave when the evening might otherwise have ended. The Doodler earned his name from this documented habit. Witnesses who survived encounters with him, and who later spoke to investigators in the years that followed, described the sketch pad as a social instrument as much as an artistic one. He would open it at a table or at the bar itself, and at some point in the course of a conversation, he would begin to draw the person he was with, or someone nearby, and the drawing would be good enough to draw attention. That is a specific kind of social capability. It is not simply the ability to draw, it is the ability to use drawing as a mechanism of connection, to take something private, the rendering of a face, and make it into a shared event, something for the person being drawn to lean toward, something for the people at the next table to glance over at, something that made the moment feel particular and warm. The bars and diners of Polk Street were, in the mid-1970s, among the most prominent social gathering points for gay men in San Francisco. Polk Gulch, as the neighborhood was known, had been a center of gay life in the city for years. Its commercial strip running north through a neighborhood of mixed residential and commercial buildings, its bars offering something that was not entirely easy to find elsewhere in that decade, a kind of open congregation, a place where gay men could be present without the particular effort of concealment that defined so much of public life at the time. The Doodler moved through these spaces with an ease that witnesses consistently noted. He was sociable, he was talkative. He appeared comfortable in the particular social environment of a gay bar in 1974, which itself tells something about the texture of his approach. He did not appear to be visiting these spaces tentatively from the outside. He appeared to inhabit them, to belong in the general atmosphere of them, to be someone a person in one of those bars would not have reason to look at twice. Multiple witnesses described the suspect as a young black man, likely in his early to mid-20s during the period in question, who carried himself with social ease and who was capable of sustaining extended, unhurried conversation across the course of a long evening, the sessions that preceded an encounter being directed toward isolation were not brief. He would spend hours in a venue, long enough to finish several drinks, long enough for the bar to cycle through its late-night crowd, long enough for the person he was with to feel that an evening had genuinely been spent in company rather than merely in transit toward something. The sketch pad stayed open on the table through these hours. The pencil came out again. The conversation continued. There is something specific about the act of being drawn. A portrait, even a quick one, even a sketch made in pencil at a bar table is a form of sustained attention directed at a single person. The person drawing has to look at the face in front of them carefully, noting the proportions, the particular set of the features, the way the eyes sit, the line of the jaw. The person being drawn knows they are being looked at with that quality of attention. It creates an intimacy, an unusual intimacy for a public space, a first encounter, a conversation that began not much earlier that same evening. The witnesses who described the Doodler's method, who described watching him pass a finished sketch across a table, a flattering likeness that made the subject look, somehow, like themselves but more composed, more worth looking at, described the effect it had. Nearby patrons leaned in. The person who had just been given the drawing held it and looked at it and usually smiled. The drawing became the evening. It became the reason the conversation had been worth having, the tangible proof of a connection made between strangers in a warm bar, while the fog moved outside and Polk Street continued its particular 1970s evening. And then, at some point, the conversation would turn toward leaving. The drawing would be folded or tucked somewhere. The bar would be getting loud or getting late. The evening would have a natural place to end, and the question of where it would end and with whom would be present in the space between the man who had done the drawing and the man who had been drawn. The investigators who worked the case in the years following the murders attributed between 14 and 16 killings to the Doodler. The range reflects the difficulty of establishing firm attribution in a case where the connections between victims were built on behavioral and circumstantial evidence, rather than on physical forensic links that could be established definitively. What the investigation found, across the documented record of the case, was a consistent set of overlapping elements: a victim profile, a geographic range, a behavioral signature, and a temporal span that together produced a coherent picture of a connected series, even where individual links remained uncertain. The victim profile that emerged across the attributed killings was specifically gay men. The Doodler frequented the bars, diners, and social venues where gay men gathered in San Francisco during the mid-1970s. This was not incidental to the operational method. The drawing, the extended socialization, the unhurried approach to an encounter, all of this was oriented toward a specific community and the specific social spaces that community occupied. The venues of Polk Street and the adjacent neighborhoods were the operational terrain, and the men who moved through those venues in the evenings were the population within which the Doodler found his victims. The geographic clustering of crime scenes, which will be traced in detail in its own account, was tight enough that investigators working the case could describe a specific zone of the city that appeared repeatedly in the documentation. The connection between the bars and diners of Polk Street and the bodies discovered at the water's edge, some miles to the west, formed a repeated spatial pattern that was one of the connective threads investigators used to attribute killings to a single individual. The temporal span of the documented killings was approximately 20 months. The record shows killings attributed to the Doodler beginning in January of 1974. The last attributed killing in the documented series falls in September of 1975. Within that span of just under 2 years, the pattern of killings established itself, was investigated, was partially identified, and then, without formal resolution, without arrest or prosecution, appears to have stopped. The word appears is important here. The cessation of attributed killings after September 1975 is a documented pattern in the case record. It is not an explanation. The record does not show what produced it. What it shows is a concentrated series across 20 months, and then an absence, the same streets, the same bars, the same fog rolling in off the Pacific, and no further killings that investigators were able to attribute to the same individual. San Francisco, in the mid-1970s, was a city in a particular social and political moment. The Castro district, not far from Polk Gulch, was beginning the transformation that would make it the most visible gay neighborhood in the country, a transformation that carried enormous political significance, that produced public figures who spoke openly about gay identity, that created something new in American civic life. Polk Street and its bars were part of the same broad social world, older and somewhat different in character, but continuous with it, a place where the long private history of gay life in the city had established itself before that history became publicly visible. The men who frequented these venues were, in a specific legal sense, members of a criminalized community. California's sodomy laws, which remained on the books through the period of the killings and beyond, defined their private lives as criminal acts. This had consequences for every aspect of how the Doodler's crimes were investigated and how they entered or failed to enter the public record. The victim's marginalized status contributed to what investigators and journalists who covered the case later described as limited law enforcement urgency in the initial response to the killings, and the coverage of the crimes in the mainstream media at the time was minimal. The bars of Polk Street and the men who occupied them in 1974 and 1975 were not, in the attention economy of that era, a population whose deaths produced the particular public pressure that drives an investigation forward at speed. What the Doodler relied on, if relied on is even the right framing for what may have been a pattern he arrived at rather than planned, was a combination of social access and social invisibility. He could enter a bar on Polk Street and spend an evening there without attracting the kind of attention that would produce a documented account of his presence. He could sit with someone for hours without that sitting being remarked upon, because the bars were full of men sitting together for hours, because this was what Polk Street offered, an extended, unhurried social evening in spaces designed for exactly that kind of time. And the portrait was simply an action a man might perform in a bar, a pleasant and memorable one, not alarming, not unusual, the kind of thing you would tell someone about the next day if you had had a next day. The composite sketch released by the San Francisco Police Department in 1975 was the result of witness descriptions gathered from people who had seen the suspect in bars and diners, who had watched him draw, who had spoken with him briefly or at length, who had been in the same room on evenings when what happened afterward was not yet visible in the scene itself. The sketch depicted a young man with specific described facial features, a face that had moved through those warm-lit interiors without leaving any trace that the available technology of 1975 could have converted into an arrest. The sketch was reproduced in local newspapers. It circulated in the community. There are accounts of people seeing it and recognizing something in it, something that matched a face they had seen in a bar, a face they had perhaps been drawn by. But the deep mistrust between San Francisco's gay community and the police department meant that even recognition, even the private certainty that the face in the sketch matched someone encountered, did not reliably translate into a phone call to an investigator. The bars on Polk Street continued their evenings. The fog came in off the water in the way it does in San Francisco, a nightly event that changes the character of the light and the feel of the streets, that softens the distance between street lamps and makes the city feel a little closer and quieter than it did in the afternoon. The bars were warm inside. The music played at the level designed to fill the room without dominating it. And somewhere in the documented record of those months, in witness accounts, in the notes of the investigators who interviewed people after the fact, in the composite sketch reproduced in grainy newsprint, there is the recurring image of a young man with a sketch pad open on a table and a pencil moving across paper in small, unhurried arcs, and a face appearing on the page that is recognizably the face of the person sitting across from him. The encounters that witnesses described were not in any documented account marked by visible tension or threat. This is worth sitting with for a moment, not as an irony, not as something designed to produce unease, but as a straightforward fact about the texture of the social mechanism, the case documents. The witnesses who reported seeing the Doodler in bars described a relaxed evening. They described someone who appeared to be having a good time, and who produced in others the sense that they too were having a good time. The drawing was part of that. The hours of conversation were part of that. The ease that multiple witnesses noted, the social fluency, the comfort in the environment, the ability to sustain a long and warm exchange was what made the encounters possible. The SFPD's investigation, which began accumulating documentation after the early 1974 killings and continued through the period when the murders appeared to have stopped, built up a picture of a suspect through witness descriptions, through the geographic pattern of crime scenes, and through the behavioral signature that gave the case its name. The sketch pad was not speculation. It was reported by multiple witnesses across multiple incidents, a recurring documented element in the accounts of people who had been in the same bars as the Doodler and had watched him work. The term Doodler itself, which appears to have originated with journalists or investigators working the case, rather than with the suspect, is somewhat lighter in register than what the documented record of the case contains. A man who drew portraits of people he had just met in bars and diners, with skill and social ease, and over the course of long evening conversations across a span of 20 months and an attributed series of 14 to 16 killings. The name stuck because it was specific to this case and to no other, because the drawing was genuinely distinctive, because it was what made this particular series of crimes identifiable as a series. A late-night diner in the Polk Street area in the mid-1970s had a specific quality of light and warmth. The booths were occupied with people for whom the evening was still going on at an hour when most of the city had settled. Coffee cups on the table, the particular unhurried pace of a conversation that is not working toward an appointment. The windows slightly fogged from the warmth inside, where the air hit the glass. Witnesses who described seeing the Doodler in diner settings described something similar. A long evening, a table where a conversation had been running for a while, a sketch pad that had been open for most of it. The drawings made in those diners were, by all witness accounts, good. They were flattering likenesses rendered in pencil, and when they were passed across the table to the person who had been drawn, the person who received them held them and looked at themselves in a way that a mirror does not quite produce. A face seen from outside, in someone else's rendering, made to look worth looking at. The last killing attributed to the Doodler in the documented case record falls in September 1975. After that month, the pattern that had produced 14 to 16 killings across 20 months of documented activity does not continue. The record holds this absence as plainly as it holds the killings that preceded it. There is no documented last night in a bar, no documented final conversation over a sketch pad, no recorded moment at which the pattern closed. There is simply a series running from January 1974 through September 1975, and then the absence of further attributed killings, the same city, the same streets, the same fog, the same bars with their warm interior light and their music held at the level designed to fill the room. What produced that cessation is not a question the record answers. The investigation continued. The composite sketch was published. The case remained open. The bars on Polk Street continued their evenings. The pencil marks that had once accumulated on sketchpad pages in those warm interiors no longer being made in quite the way they had been made across those 20 months. Why the killings attributed to the Doodler stopped when they stopped, whether something changed in the suspect's circumstances, in his access to these spaces, in his presence in San Francisco, or in some quality of the decision-making that had produced the killings, the documented record does not establish. It notes the cessation. It does not account for it. The sketch pad on the table, the pencil moving in small, unhurried arcs, the face appearing on the page. These are the images the case leaves behind it, specific and particular, belonging to this documented history and to no other. A young man in a bar on Polk Street in 1974, drawing the face of someone he had just met in the warm interior light, while the fog moved outside and the music played at the level designed not to dominate. The drawing would have been good, the conversation would have gone on. The evening, for a long time, would have looked like exactly what it appeared to be. The attributed killings, 14 to 16 of them, connected by victim profile, by geography, by behavioral signature, by the documented presence of a young man with a sketch pad, they are in the record. They were investigated. They are still in the record, in a file that has not been closed, in a case that remains formally open. And the question of what caused the pattern to end in September 1975, after 20 months of documented activity, is one the record holds open without offering anything to put in the place of an answer. The Doodler stopped. The case and the question did not. Ocean Beach runs along the western edge of San Francisco for nearly 3 miles, a wide, flat expanse of sand and wind that faces the Pacific directly, without interruption. There are no sheltered coves along this stretch, no rocky outcroppings to break the force of what comes in off the water. The beach is simply open, to the west, to the wind, to whatever weather the Pacific is carrying on any given night. The surf here is not quiet. It arrives with the particular insistence of deep ocean water that has traveled a long way and meets the continent with a sound that carries inland for several blocks, audible even from the streets behind the park, even when the fog has closed in and the water itself is invisible. On nights when the fog sat low over the city in the middle years of the 1970s, Ocean Beach was a place defined almost entirely by sound and cold, the surf arriving in steady intervals, the wind moving across the flat sand, the nearest light, a distant suggestion from the direction of the great highway behind the dunes. It was along this coastline that investigators documented the discovery of multiple victims connected to what would later be called the Doodler case. The specific locations of those discoveries varied across the length of the beach, but the pattern held: the water nearby, the city behind, the sand between them, wide and flat, and largely empty in the hours when these things occurred. The beach was not hidden, exactly, but it offered a particular kind of exposure that functioned as its own form of concealment. A place so open, so far from the warmth and noise of interior spaces, that its openness made it quiet in a way that an enclosed alley or a park path could not replicate. What investigators registered about Ocean Beach as a recurring location in the case was precisely this quality. It was a place that the city turned its back to at night. The Great Highway runs immediately inland of the beach, a straight road that follows the coastline north toward the Cliff House and south toward the zoo. In the 1970s, as now, it separated the sand from the first line of residential streets, and behind those streets the dunes gave way to the western margin of Golden Gate Park. The geography here moves quickly from the completely exposed to the deeply sheltered. A person walking east from the beach would within a few minutes pass from the open sand across the highway into the tree line at the park's western edge, and the change would be immediate and total. The surf would still be audible. The light would disappear. Golden Gate Park occupies more than 1,000 acres in the western portion of San Francisco, a long rectangular expanse of landscaped grounds, open meadows, and dense planted woodland that runs from the Panhandle east of Stanyan Street all the way to the ocean. The park's western end, nearest to the beach, is its least developed section, where the trees are thick and the paths less traveled, and the distance from the nearest streetlight is considerable. During the day, the park accommodates families and cyclists and people walking dogs along its main roads, and the interior feels managed and open. At night, the picture changes. The paths that run through the wooded sections become genuinely dark, the canopy overhead blocking the ambient light that filters in from surrounding streets. And the quiet that settles over those areas is the particular quiet of a place that has been largely vacated, the city still present all around, but somehow distant. Investigators working the Doodler case noted the proximity of Golden Gate Park's western reaches to the Ocean Beach crime scenes. The two locations were not identical. A victim found on the beach and a victim found within the park perimeter were found in distinct places with distinct physical characters, but the distance between them, measured in city blocks, was not large. A person moving between the bar district to the north and east and the beach or the park's western edge was traveling through a corridor that the investigators, as they accumulated case records through 1974 and 1975, began to understand as a single operational zone. The geography had its own internal logic. It connected spaces that served different social functions. The warm and lit interior of a bar or diner, the open and isolated expanse of the beach, the wooded darkness of the park's outer sections, and a person who moved fluidly between those kinds of spaces across the course of an evening could transit from one to another without drawing particular attention at any point along the route. Polk Street lies several miles to the northeast of Ocean Beach, running through the neighborhood known as Polk Gulch in a north-south line that by the mid-1970s had developed into one of San Francisco's most significant concentrations of gay social life. The street's commercial character during this period was shaped by its bars, its late-night diners, and the particular kind of social activity that happens in places open late, where people drift between establishments over the course of a long evening, and the movement between one door and the next is as much a part of the night as the time spent inside. The bars along Polk Street in the middle years of the 1970s varied in size and character. Some were small and close, with booths and low light, others more open and louder, but they shared the quality of being places where people came, not for a single drink and a quick exit, but for the extended, unhurried business of an evening spent in company. The Polk Gulch neighborhood in those years occupied a particular social position in San Francisco. The Castro district further south was in the middle of a rapid transformation that would, by the end of the decade, make it the most politically organized and visible gay neighborhood in the country. Polk Gulch preceded that transformation by several years as a gathering place, a neighborhood where the social infrastructure of bars and community venues had been established without the explicit political identity that the Castro was developing. Men came to Polk Street in the early and middle 1970s to socialize in spaces that were, within the context of the bar and diner scene, understood to be welcoming, without those spaces being marked in the more prominent, public-facing way that the Castro's storefronts and painted signs would later project. The character of Polk Gulch was still somewhat interior, oriented toward the people already inside, less visible from the sidewalk, less declared. This quality, the semi-enclosed social world of a neighborhood's late-night commercial strip, was part of what made Polk Street a space the Doodler is believed to have frequented. The bars and diners there were places where a person who arrived alone could spend several hours without that solitude attracting notice. The nature of those spaces encouraged the kind of extended, sociable interaction that moved easily between strangers and made it unremarkable for someone to settle at a table, open a sketch pad, and spend the better part of an evening drawing and talking and watching who came in and out through the front door. The social texture of Polk Street in the 1970s was, according to witness accounts gathered by investigators, one in which someone with the patience to stay late and the ability to engage easily with people he had just met could move through an entire evening without anyone finding his presence unusual. The specific late-night diners in and around Polk Street became locations of particular investigative interest as the Doodler case developed. Witnesses reported seeing a young man matching the suspect's description at tables in these establishments over multiple evenings across 1974 and 1975. And in some documented instances, those witnesses described seeing the man draw portraits of other patrons, men who were in some cases later identified in connection with the investigation. The diners functioned differently from the bars. The lighting was brighter, the atmosphere more settled, the clientele a mix of people who had come directly for coffee and a late meal, and people who had drifted over from nearby bars as the evening wore on. In a late-night diner, a conversation that had begun in a bar could continue for hours, deepening past the point of casual acquaintance into the kind of extended, detailed exchange that made two people who had met that evening feel, by the time they left, that they had known each other considerably longer. The investigative record places specific diners near Polk Street as locations where witnesses reported encounters with the suspect, and some of those witnesses reported that the portraits drawn at those tables were not quick or approximate things. They were careful, flattering likenesses, completed with an attention to the subject that communicated genuine artistic engagement. Multiple accounts described the portrait being passed across the table to its subject, and the effect of that exchange, a stranger having seen and drawn your face with skill and offered you that image, was, by the reports of those who experienced it, notable. Nearby patrons apparently took notice. The sketch pad on the table, the face appearing under the pencil, the finished drawing slid towards someone who was then holding a rendered version of themselves in their own hands. These were not things that happened in most bar or diner encounters. They made the person doing the drawing distinctive, and they made the interaction between the artist and his subject something that lingered in the memory of people who had been nearby and seen it happen. Running south of Polk Gulch, the Tenderloin District occupied a dense stretch of the city's geography that, in the 1970s, was home to a significant population of gay men, many of whom frequented the bars and social spaces of Polk Street, a few blocks to the north. The Tenderloin in this era was a neighborhood of residential hotels and rooming houses, of streets that were active late, and whose population included people whose social and economic circumstances placed them outside the more stable residential arrangements of the city's other neighborhoods. For many gay men in mid-1970s San Francisco, the Tenderloin offered inexpensive housing within walking distance of the social infrastructure of Polk Gulch, and the two neighborhoods functioned, in practice, as a single extended zone. A person could leave a bar on Polk Street at 1 or 2 in the morning and be home in a Tenderloin hotel room within 15 minutes of walking. This geographic proximity meant that the men who frequented Polk Street's social venues were, in many cases, men who lived nearby, men whose residences were within a short distance of the places they socialized. The route between a Polk Street bar and a Tenderloin rooming house ran through the same streets, past the same late-night storefronts, through the same patches of relative darkness at the edges of well-lit blocks. The Tenderloin streets in the small hours of a weeknight were not entirely empty. The neighborhood kept late hours, its residential hotels receiving and releasing people through the night. But the particular stretch of sidewalk between one person's last drink and their front door was, at certain hours, quiet and largely unwatched. The distance between Polk Gulch and Ocean Beach, measured in city blocks, is roughly 1.5 miles traveling west, with Golden Gate Park beginning partway along that route and the beach at its far edge. Traveling that distance on foot at night in the 1970s, through the western sections of the city, a person would have moved from the lit and active commercial strip of Polk Street, through progressively quieter residential blocks, into the long dark of the park's northern and western edges, and then out onto the sand with the Pacific in front of them and the city entirely behind. The transition would not have been abrupt at any single point along the route, but cumulative, light giving way to dim, dim giving way to dark, sound shifting from traffic and voices to wind and water. A person walking that route at 1 or 2 in the morning, having left a bar or diner sometime before, would have passed through all the registers of the city's nocturnal geography before arriving at the one place along the route that was genuinely, completely isolated. Investigators working the case through 1974 and 1975 built a geographic picture of the Doodler's movements that moved between these zones in a documented pattern. The initial contact appeared to occur in the social spaces of Polk Street, the bars, the diners, the extended late-night conversations at tables where a sketch pad was open. The crime scenes were consistently further west in the open coastal landscape or the wooded darkness of Golden Gate Park's outer sections. The path between those two categories of location was a specific traversable route through a specific city, and the repetition of that route across multiple documented cases gave investigators a spatial framework for understanding how the suspect's activity unfolded across an evening. The composite sketch released by the San Francisco Police Department in 1975 was circulated through local media and posted in the Polk Street corridor and surrounding neighborhoods. The sketch depicted a young black man with specific described facial features, a wide face, particular proportions around the eyes and jaw, a general affect of youthfulness that witnesses had consistently noted in their accounts. For the men who frequented Polk Street's venues, the sketch represented a face they might have seen at a table with a sketch pad open, a face that had perhaps been pointed out by a friend on a previous evening as belonging to someone who drew portraits of people he met. The distribution of that sketch through a neighborhood with established social networks meant that the image circulated through conversation, as well as through newsprint, passed along among people who knew each other from the bars and the diners and the long evenings that defined Polk Street's social life. The sketch's circulation did not produce a prosecution, for reasons documented across the investigative record. The deep mutual suspicion between the gay community and the San Francisco Police Department in those years created a barrier that the release of a composite image could not simply dissolve. Men who might have recognized the face, or who might have had additional information about the suspect's movements or habits, had substantial reasons not to approach the SFPD with what they knew. The sketch existed in the neighborhood, and among the people most likely to have useful information about the person it depicted, and it persisted there without generating the kind of direct cooperation that would have moved the investigation toward a prosecution. The Polk Street corridor itself has a physical character that is worth holding in mind when following the geographic record of this case. The street runs on a slight diagonal through Polk Gulch, its commercial character concentrated in the blocks between about Sacramento and Broadway, where the bars and restaurants and late-night establishments were clustered most densely. The buildings along this stretch are typically 3 or 4 stories, with ground floor commercial space and residential floors above, and the sidewalk is wide enough that the foot traffic of a busy evening on Polk Street would not have felt crowded, but would have provided a consistent human presence. People arriving, people leaving, people standing outside a bar, entrants talking before going in or after coming out. Bar signs in the 1970s on this street were illuminated in the manner of the era, some neon, some simpler, the light they cast tinting the fog on nights when the city was socked in and the moisture in the air caught and diffused everything. On those foggy nights, in the middle years of the 1970s offered many, Polk Street would have looked exactly like the bar district it was, warm and lit from inside the establishments themselves, with the particular quality that lit interiors acquire when they are seen through a fogged window or from across a foggy street, the warmth of the light seeming more contained and definite against the gray outside. A person sitting at a window table in one of Polk Street's diners on a foggy night, with a cup of coffee and a sketch pad open on the table in front of them, would have had a view of this street as it appeared when the city was at its most characteristically atmospheric, the fog diffusing the bar signs, the figures moving along the sidewalk, appearing and disappearing in the ambient light, the street extending in both directions until the fog absorbed it. Moving west from Polk Street, the character of the city's streetscape changes gradually. The commercial density of Polk Gulch gives way to residential blocks in the western addition, and then the Richmond district, quieter streets of houses and apartment buildings, where the commercial activity is more scattered, a corner store, an occasional restaurant, the lighter traffic of a neighborhood street rather than a commercial corridor. The further west one travels, the more the city quiets, and by the time the western Richmond streets are running close to the park, the nighttime quiet is considerable. The fog, if it is present, gives the streetlights on these residential blocks a softness that the brighter commercial lighting of Polk Street does not produce. Everything is slightly dimmer, slightly less defined. Golden Gate Park's northern boundary along Fulton Street is where the city's residential grid meets the park's tree line. Crossing from Fulton into the park after dark in the 1970s, a person would have moved from the lit sidewalk of a residential street into a space where the formal geometry of the grid disappeared, and the darkness was shaped instead by the park's landscape, its planted trees, its rolling terrain, its paths that diverged and rejoined without the predictability of a city block. The park contains a great deal of open meadow in its interior sections, but the paths that approach from the western end move through more densely planted areas, where the tree canopy is closer overhead and the ambient light from surrounding streets does not penetrate as directly. At night, in those sections, the park has the quality of a place that has withdrawn from the city around it. The western edge of the park, where it approaches the beach, is the section most removed from the city's ambient light and activity. Here the planted landscapes give way to the original coastal scrub that characterized this part of San Francisco before the park was established. Low vegetation adapted to the wind and salt air, not the tall eucalyptus and Monterey pine of the park's interior plantings. The terrain here is more open than the wooded interior sections, but the openness is that of a windswept coastal margin rather than of a managed park landscape. At night, this section of the park occupies a transitional zone between the city's western residential blocks, the park's interior darkness, and the absolute openness of the beach beyond. It is the part of the route that might be described as neither one thing nor another, not quite park, not quite beach, not quite city, a threshold zone that the investigative record places in repeated proximity to the case's crime scenes. The physical documentation of where victims were found along this geographic corridor was consistent enough across multiple cases that investigators developed a clear spatial picture of the Doodler's operational range. The contact zone, Polk Street and its surrounding neighborhood, and the crime scene zone, the beach and the park's western sections, were connected by a specific traversable distance through a specific city. The route was not hidden, not unusual, not the kind of path that required local knowledge to find. It was a straightforward westward transit from a neighborhood's commercial center to the edge of a large park, and then to the coastline beyond. What distinguished it, in the context of the investigative record, was its repeated appearance across the documentation of multiple unconnected events. The same spatial relationship, the same directional movement, the same two categories of location appearing again and again in the records accumulated between January 1974 and September 1975. The Tenderloin's relationship to this geography is somewhat different. The Tenderloin lies south and slightly east of Polk Gulch, and its residents' relationship to the beach and the park was mediated by distance and by the character of the neighborhoods between. A man leaving a Tenderloin hotel room to walk to Polk Street traveled north through a few blocks of transitional neighborhood before arriving at the bar district. A man leaving Polk Street late at night, heading back toward a Tenderloin address, was traveling in the opposite direction from the beach, east and south rather than west. The Tenderloin's significance in the geographic record of this case is less about where crimes occurred and more about who the victims were and where they lived. The rooming houses and residential hotels of the Tenderloin were home to many of the men who frequented Polk Street, and so the Tenderloin represents the residential anchor of the social world that the Doodler is documented to have moved through, the neighborhood that sent its residents northward toward Polk Street in the evenings and received them back in the small hours of the morning. Investigators mapping the geography of the Doodler case would have found themselves working with a roughly triangular zone on a map of western San Francisco, with Ocean Beach forming the western edge, the Polk Street corridor forming the northeastern point, and the western sections of Golden Gate Park filling the space between. Within that triangle, the documented sites of social contact and the documented sites of victim discovery occupied distinct positions. The bar district to the northeast, the coastal landscape to the west, and the park's wooded terrain fell between them, accessible from both directions. The map of the case is not complicated. The points on it are not far from one another. On a clear night, standing at the right elevation in Golden Gate Park, both Polk Street to the east and the Pacific to the west would have been in the same general field of vision, separated by a few miles of city and ocean air. These streets and neighborhoods are not theoretical locations reconstructed from records. They are still there. The Polk Street corridor is still a street of bars and restaurants running through a neighborhood that retains in its bones the character it had in the 1970s. The buildings are much the same. The fog still arrives from the west. Ocean Beach is still a wide, flat expanse of sand facing the Pacific, still noisy with surf, still dark at night with the city a long walk behind it. Golden Gate Park's western sections are still what they were, the same tree lines, the same paths, the same quality of darkness, once the ambient light from surrounding streets has been absorbed by the canopy overhead. The map that investigators assembled in 1974 and 1975 continues to correspond in its physical geography to the city that exists today. A person standing on Ocean Beach after midnight and turning to face east would see across the flat sand and the highway and the tree line at the park's edge the faint general glow of the city's ambient light, diffuse and indirect, filling the sky above the buildings, but not illuminating the beach itself. The beach would be dark and wide and loud with surf. The city would be behind and above, existing as light rather than as anything more specific. Between the two, between the person on the sand and the glow of the city, the park would lie in its particular darkness, its paths and its tree lines invisible from the beach, its presence indicated only by the absence of the city's glow in that direction, a band of relative darkness between the surf and the streets. It is this band of relative darkness, Golden Gate Park's western section, running between the beach and the residential neighborhoods to its north and east, that appears most consistently in the spatial record of the Doodler case. The park's interior offered what the beach and the Polk Street corridor, each in their different ways, did not. The beach was open and exposed, the bar district lit and populated. The park's outer sections occupied the middle condition, neither fully public nor fully isolated, reachable on foot from either direction, dark enough to render the surrounding city remote, close enough to that city that the distance traveled from a bar or diner to reach it was not, on a clear night with the intention to walk, particularly far. The late-night diners near Polk Street that appear in the investigative witness accounts were, by the nature of their business, open to anyone who came through the door and sat down. They offered coffee, warmth, the kind of unhurried seating that allowed an evening to extend into early morning without anyone at a nearby table taking particular notice. In a bar, the rhythm of the evening is shaped by drinks ordered and the cycling presence of people who arrive and leave. In a diner, the rhythm is flatter, more indefinite, and a person who arrived at 10 and was still there at 2 was not anomalous in the way they might have been in a venue with a more clearly defined pace. The diners near Polk Street in the 1970s served a clientele that included people who had just come from the bars a block or two away, people who lived nearby and came in simply because they were hungry at an odd hour, and people for whom the warmth and the availability of coffee at 2 in the morning represented a reason to stay for a while, somewhere quiet and lit. It was in these kinds of spaces, extended, unhurried, socially permeable, that the portrait drawing apparently functioned most effectively as a method of contact. The extended hours of a diner evening gave the drawing time to be completed carefully. The relatively bright interior lighting of a diner, unlike the dimmer atmosphere of a bar, made the work of drawing a legible face under a pencil a practical possibility. The proximity of other patrons, close enough to notice the sketch pad and the emerging likeness, created a small social audience for the drawing, and that audience gave the exchange between artist and subject a degree of public witness that paradoxically may have made the interaction feel more open and therefore more safe to the person sitting across the table. A stranger who draws your face in front of other people in a bright late-night diner is performing a very specific kind of social openness. His attention is visible, his interest is declared, his action is not hidden from the room around him. The geography of the case contains, in its documented spatial record, both the social world in which these contacts were made and the isolated coastal landscape in which the consequences of those contacts were later documented. Polk Street and Ocean Beach occupy opposite ends of the same general region of western San Francisco, connected by a specific distance and a traversable route. Golden Gate Park sits between them, offering its own intermediate geography to the record. The Tenderloin provides the residential context for the men who moved through Polk Street's social spaces and whose lives were documented in the investigative record assembled by the SFPD through the 20 months that the case file covers. Ocean Beach, Golden Gate Park, and the Polk Street corridor form a concentrated geographic zone in the western part of San Francisco. Those three locations named in the investigative record, documented in the case files accumulated across 1974 and 1975, are separated from one another by a few miles of city streets and parkland. They are physically present, unchanged in their locations. The fog still comes in off the Pacific and moves across Ocean Beach toward the city. The park's tree lines are where they always were. The Polk Street corridor still runs north to south through its neighborhood, its bars and restaurants still lit from inside on evenings when the fog sits low and the street extends in both directions until the gray absorbs it. The map that the investigative record traces, three named places, connected by documented events, occupying the same positions on the western edge of the same city, remains in all its physical particulars, exactly the map it always was. Gerald Cavanagh's name appears in the case record as one of the few victims in this series whose identity was formally confirmed and publicly reported. Among the men connected to the Doodler's known period of activity, most remained unnamed, their identities withheld, undisclosed, or simply never fully established within the public documentation. His name is there, in the record, a specific person attached to a specific case, and that specificity carries a particular weight when set against the long list of what this investigation could not recover and could not confirm. The case file accumulated over months and then years. What it contains beyond the documented crime scene reports and the investigative notes and the forensic findings from the western edge of the city is also a record of absence, names that were known to investigators but never spoken in public, identities that moved through the investigation in private and left no visible mark on what the public record holds. Gerald Cavanagh's name stands in that record as a named individual among many who were not named, a confirmation in a case built significantly from things that could not be confirmed. What the investigation also holds is the documented existence of survivors. At least 3 men were known to law enforcement in San Francisco during the mid-1970s, men who had encountered the Doodler and survived those encounters, who had spoken with investigators and provided enough information for a suspect to be identified. They knew what they had seen. They knew what had happened to them. The case file contains what they told investigators in those conversations. What it does not contain, what it could never contain, was their public testimony. Each of them declined to testify openly. Each of them declined to participate in any legal proceeding that would have required their identities to be disclosed. The investigation moved as far as it could move, and at a certain point it came to the edge of what those men were able to give, and it stopped there. The reasons were not complicated. They were also not simple. The social world that these men inhabited in San Francisco in the mid-1970s was one in which the act of identifying oneself publicly as a gay man carried consequences that were not theoretical and not distant. They were immediate and documented and well understood by everyone involved. The investigators understood them. The district attorney's office understood them. The men who had survived encounters with a killer and then sat in interview rooms and provided what information they could, they understood them better than anyone. One of the survivors was identified in subsequent reporting as a diplomat from Europe, a man whose professional role was bound to a formal public identity maintained across official documents and institutional affiliations of the kind that could not have survived the exposure that public testimony would have required. His name has never been publicly disclosed. What has been reported is the nature of the bind that his position created, the distance between the private knowledge he held and the public role he occupied was, in practical terms, an uncrossable one. He could tell investigators what he knew. He could not tell a courtroom. And without the courtroom, what he told the investigators could carry the investigation only so far. A second high-profile survivor was identified in reporting as a man whose livelihood was built on a public persona that his public life depended on maintaining intact. The details of that persona and the career it supported have not been fully confirmed in the public record, but what reporting established was the specific nature of the impossibility he faced. Cooperation with investigators in private and without public consequence was something he offered. Participation in proceedings that would have required his identity to be disclosed as a gay man in the mid-1970s in the context of a criminal case, that was something he could not offer. The account he gave investigators stayed within the walls where it was given. It did not travel further. There is something worth pausing on in the image of those interview rooms. A fluorescent lit space in an SFPD building, voices kept low, a detective and a survivor on opposite sides of a table. The detective knows that what is said in that room is genuinely useful. It is in fact the most useful information the investigation has. The survivor knows this too. Both of them also know, with a clarity that required no discussion, that what is said in that room is going to stay there. The documentation that resulted from those conversations did not produce a prosecution. It produced a confirmed suspect, an identified individual, and a set of circumstances in which the district attorney's office looked at the case that had been built and concluded that it could not be taken further. What the survivors provided was not nothing. It was not enough. The third survivor, who was known to investigators, has been described in available reporting in less specific terms than the diplomat and the entertainer. What has been established is that there were at least 3 men who had direct knowledge of the Doodler, who had seen him, sat with him, and survived what the 14 to 16 men who did not survive had not survived, and that none of them could bring that knowledge into a public forum. The investigation had its witnesses. It simply could not use them in the way that a prosecution requires witnesses to be used. Inspector Rotea Guilford, who led the Doodler investigation during its most active period, worked with what the case had given him and worked against the conditions that the case had also given him. What the conditions had given him in terms of obstacles was not primarily a forensic problem. The evidence existed. A suspect had been identified. The men who could connect that suspect to the crimes had given Guilford what they could give. The problem was the architecture of the world those men were living in, a legal and social structure that made the act of speaking publicly as a gay man in a criminal proceeding a form of self-exposure that carried its own serious risks. Those risks were not invented by the survivors who faced them. They were codified. California's sodomy statute, as it stood in 1974, classified consensual sexual acts between adults of the same sex as criminal offenses. The men who had been victimized by the Doodler, whether they had survived or not, were members of a community that the state of California, in the same year those crimes were committed, had formally defined as criminal. To come forward as a victim was to come forward as a member of a criminalized population. To testify publicly was to testify as a person whose private life, if examined, could result in prosecution under a law that was still on the books and still enforced. The statute was not a relic that no one enforced. It was an active legal instrument in the mid-1970s, and the San Francisco Police Department itself had a documented history of using it. The relationship between the SFPD and San Francisco's gay community during the 1970s was shaped by that history, by documented entrapment operations, by harassment, by the pattern of treatment that gay men had experienced at the hands of the same institution that was now asking for their cooperation in identifying a killer. The request was genuine. The danger the survivors associated with responding to it publicly was also genuine. The sodomy statute in California was not repealed until 1975. That repeal came during the same period when the Doodler's killings appear to have ceased, approximately the same months by the documented timeline. But during the period when the murders were occurring, from January 1974 through the active investigative phase of 1975, the law was in place. Every victim who was killed during that period, every witness who sat in an interview room and told an investigator what they knew, every man who passed a night in one of the bars or diners on Polk Street or along the streets of the Tenderloin, each of them was navigating a city in which the state classified them as criminals for who they were and who they loved. The Doodler moved through that same city, and he moved through it knowing, on some level, what the law meant for the men he approached. The impact of that legal reality on the investigation was not incidental. It was structural. It shaped the number of witnesses who could be recovered. It shaped the quality of cooperation that investigators could realistically expect from a community that had learned, through experience, that the legal system was not reliably on their side. It shaped the decisions of the 3 survivors who held the case's best available evidence in their own accounts and could not bring those accounts into a public proceeding. The statute did not commit the murders. What it did was ensure that the community most directly affected by those murders was the community least protected by the institutions that were supposed to respond to them. There were men who died in this case whose names are not in the public record. The documentation acknowledges their existence, 14 to 16 victims, by the investigators' accounting, connected by victim profile and geographic pattern, and the consistent behavioral signature of the Doodler's method. Of those men, only a handful were publicly identified. The rest remain in the record as cases, as evidence, as connected incidents in a documented series, without names attached to the public documentation. Some of this is a matter of incomplete investigation. Some of it is a matter of the same forces that prevented the survivors from speaking. Families who did not know, or who knew and did not want it known, or who were themselves in circumstances that made disclosure dangerous or impossible. What the record does hold, specifically, is Gerald Kavanaugh's name. It is there because it became part of the documented public record in a way that most of the other victims' names did not. It is not the only name that exists. Investigators had more, but it is one of the names that crossed from the internal investigation into the public accounting of the case, and its presence in the record functions as a kind of anchor. It is proof that these were specific people. It is a name placed against the anonymity that surrounded most of what this case contains. The survivors who cooperated with investigators were not silent about what they knew. They were silent about where they knew it, about the public forums and the legal proceedings and the courtrooms where what they knew would have needed to go for it to matter in the way the law requires. The distinction is worth holding carefully. These were men who told the truth to investigators. They told it in the rooms where it could be told without destroying them. They told it to people who listened and who understood why it could not go further. The detective who received those accounts knew he was receiving something that the law as it stood could not fully use. The survivors who provided those accounts knew the same thing. What they did was not nothing. What it cost them to do even that much. To sit across from an SFPD detective in 1975 and describe what had happened to them is not something the record fully documents, but it is something the record implies. There is a particular quality to the accounts that survived in this investigation. The accounts of men who had sat with the Doodler, had accepted the portrait he drew of them, had spent hours in the particular warmth of a late-night bar or a diner booth, and who had then encountered something that the men who did not survive those encounters had also encountered, and who had come through it and then faced the question of what to do with what they now knew. The question was not abstract. The answer was determined by conditions that existed outside the survivors themselves. Legal conditions, social conditions, the documented reality of what public exposure meant for a gay man in San Francisco in the mid-1970s. Inspector Guilford's investigation reached the point where a suspect was identified. That was not a small thing. In a case with the structural obstacles this one presented, the victim community's documented mistrust of the SFPD, the legal conditions that constrained cooperation, the forensic limitations of 1970s crime scene analysis, the geography of the Ocean Beach crime scenes, and the difficulty of recovering useful physical evidence from a coastal outdoor environment. Reaching the point of a named suspect represented a significant accumulation of investigative work. What the investigation could not do was convert that named suspect into a prosecution, because a prosecution required witnesses who could appear in public, and the witnesses who existed could not appear in public without consequences the law itself had created. The district attorney's office in San Francisco declined to file charges. That decision was not made carelessly. It was made because the case as built could not be taken into a courtroom without the public testimony of the survivors, and the survivors' public testimony was not available. The evidence existed. The suspect had a name. The case had everything it needed, except the one thing that the legal and social structure of the mid-1970s had made impossible to obtain. The decision not to prosecute was a procedural outcome produced by those conditions. It was the investigation arriving at the boundary that the world around it had drawn. What remained after that decision was a case file, an identified suspect whose name stayed in the internal documentation, physical evidence preserved from the Ocean Beach crime scenes, and a set of survivors who had told investigators what they knew and who then returned to their lives carrying a specific knowledge that no public proceeding had ever received. The diplomat returned to his diplomatic work. The entertainer returned to his public career. The third survivor returned to whatever life the record does not describe in detail. Each of them continued to exist in the world with an account that had been given to investigators in private, and that the investigation had not been able to use in the way that it needed to be used. The victims who were not survivors did not return to anything. The record holds their cases, the crime scenes, the forensic findings, the investigative notes accumulated over months of work by Guilford and his colleagues. Gerald Kavanaugh's name is among the names that are in that record. One point of confirmed identification in a series where most of the confirmed identifications remained internal to the investigation. What the public account of this case holds for those victims is limited. What the case file holds may be more. What is known with certainty is that their deaths were documented, that their deaths were connected, and that the investigation that attempted to answer for those deaths was brought to a halt by conditions that were not of the investigation's making. The sodomy statute was one of those conditions. It did not operate abstractly, it operated as a legal reality that shaped specific decisions made by specific people in specific rooms in San Francisco in 1974 and 1975. A survivor sitting in an interview room and deciding not to testify publicly was making a rational decision within a legal framework that classified him as a criminal. A witness who had seen the Doodler drawing a portrait in a Polk Street bar and who declined to provide that observation in a public proceeding was calculating the risks of that disclosure against the risks of silence and arriving at a conclusion that the law's own text supported. These were not failures of civic courage. They were responses to a documented legal reality that had been constructed by the same state that was now asking its victims to trust it. The case stayed open. The physical evidence stayed in storage. The named suspect, a person whose name appeared in the internal investigation but never in a public charging document, continued to exist somewhere in the world, in whatever circumstances the years produced. The survivors continued their lives. The investigation went quiet, though it did not officially close. Guilford worked other cases. The files accumulated in the SFPD's record system, not resolved, not discarded, held in the particular administrative suspension that characterizes cases where everything necessary for a prosecution was present, except the one thing that could not be compelled. The men who were lost in this case were lost, in part because the world they lived in had been arranged in a way that made the legal system's response to violence against them structurally inadequate. That is a statement about the documented record, not an editorialized claim. The sodomy statute is a real document. Its text classified gay men as criminals. That classification shaped the investigation at every point where cooperation between the gay community and law enforcement would have been necessary. The SFPD's documented history of harassment of gay men is also a real record. The survivors' decisions to protect themselves by limiting their cooperation are documented decisions made in response to a documented reality. The case file holds all of this. It holds the investigation that Guilford conducted and the obstacles the investigation encountered, and the point at which the legal system could not proceed further. What it also holds is Gerald Kavanaugh's name and the names of the other victims who were formally identified in the internal record, and the accounts of 3 men who sat with investigators and gave what they could give, and the forensic materials collected from the western edge of the city and preserved against the possibility of a future the 1970s could not fully anticipate. The file holds all of this. It held it through the years when the investigation was quiet, and it held it through the long period when the case received no public attention, and it holds it now. The specific quality of what the survivors faced deserves to be held with care. These were men who had been targeted, who had survived, and who were then placed in a situation where the protection they might have expected from the law was contingent on exposing themselves to that same law in ways that carried real danger. The diplomat whose position depended on a public identity that did not include what he had experienced. The entertainer whose career required a public persona that the truth of his private life could not have coexisted with. The third man whose circumstances the record does not describe in equivalent detail, but who faced the same fundamental structure of impossible choices. Each of them made a decision that the legal context around them had made rational. Each of them lived with the outcome of that decision. The case file documents what their cooperation produced. It does not document, and perhaps cannot document, what it was to carry that knowledge in private for the years that followed. There is a kind of account that lives entirely within institutions: the police report, the investigative file, the district attorney's decision not to prosecute. Those documents are real and important. They are the bones of what can be known about this case from the outside. What they do not fully contain is the human experience of the people those documents are about. The survivors who told investigators what they knew and then watched the case go nowhere. The families of victims who may not have known what had happened, or who may have known and been unable to speak about it. The community of men who moved through Polk Street in the Tenderloin during those 20 months, and who understood, on some level, that something was happening in their world that the institutions around them were not adequately addressing. The case file holds Gerald Kavanaugh's name. It holds the records of 3 known survivors who were interviewed and who cooperated privately but not publicly. It holds the identified suspect whose name never appeared in a courtroom. It holds the physical evidence from Ocean Beach and the investigative documentation from those months of work. What it does not hold, and what no document can fully hold, is the silence that surrounded all of this, the specific enforced silence produced by a legal framework that treated the victims as criminals, and the social framework that made public identification as a gay man a risk that most men could not reasonably be expected to take. California's sodomy statute remained in effect through the active period of the Doodler murders. It was repealed in 1975. The repeal did not retroactively change what had happened in the years when it was in force. It did not recover the cases that could not be prosecuted because of what it required of the people who might have made prosecution possible. It did not return anything to the men who were lost, or to the survivors who had held their knowledge in private rooms with investigators and then carried it back out into a world that was not ready to receive it publicly. What it represents in the documented record of this case is the most precise answer available to the question of why a killer who was identified went unprosecuted. Not the only answer. The forensic limitations of the era mattered. The investigation's structural challenges mattered. The geography of the crime scenes mattered. But underneath all of those specific obstacles was this one, a set of words in the California Penal Code that defined the community the victims came from as a criminal community, and that made the act of seeking justice for violence committed against members of that community contingent on those members accepting a form of public exposure that the law itself had made dangerous. The statute was a document. It had specific language. It had a section number and a legislative history, and a text that named specific acts as criminal. It was the kind of document that most people in California in 1974 would not have needed to think about directly in the course of an ordinary day. For gay men in San Francisco in 1974, it was not an abstract legal text. It was a daily condition of their existence. It was the reason the Doodler's survivors sat in interview rooms and gave investigators what they could give, and then declined to give what the law required. It was the reason Gerald Kavanaugh's name is one of only a handful of confirmed identifications in a case connected to 14 to 16 deaths. It was, in the documented historical record, a set of words on a page that functioned as the reason a killer went free. Inspector Rota Guilford worked a desk in the San Francisco Police Department in the mid-1970s in a building that smelled of paper and floor wax and the particular exhaustion of long hours. The case files in front of him were real. They had weight. The documents that made up the Doodler investigation had accumulated across months by that point, each new edition representing something found, or something that had failed to yield what was hoped for, and Guilford worked through them with the methodical attention of someone who understood that the record was all that remained of what had happened, and that the record had to be treated carefully, because without it there was nothing at all. Guilford was one of the few black detectives working high-profile cases in the SFPD during that era. That is a documented fact about who was assigned to this investigation and what his position represented inside the department he worked for. He had built a case. The investigation he led had produced something meaningful, a direction, a developed picture of the person investigators believed responsible, a body of witness information gathered through interviews conducted under significant difficulty. What the investigation found, despite those difficulties, was enough to form the basis of an identification. It had not been enough to do anything further with that identification, and the reasons for that shortfall were not procedural failures, so much as the documented shape of the world the investigation had been conducted inside. The case had begun accumulating in January 1974, and by the following year, it had become something the department had concluded could not remain invisible. Guilford had spent months pursuing witness accounts from men who had been in the bars and diners along Polk Street, men who had seen the suspect, men who had sat across from him and watched him draw. The composite sketch released by the SFPD in 1975 was the material product of that work. It depicted a young black man with specific described facial features, the result of multiple witness descriptions collated into a single rendered image by a police artist, printed and circulated through local San Francisco media outlets. It appeared in newsprint. It was reproduced in the particular grainy way that newspaper images of that period reproduced things, the hatching of a composite illustration sitting in a half-tone grid, the face given enough specificity that someone who knew the person being depicted would have recognized the likeness. The response to the composite sketch was limited. Some calls came in, some leads were followed. None of them resolved into the kind of actionable information the investigation needed, and there were structural reasons for that beyond the basic difficulty of composite recognition. The gay community in San Francisco in the mid-1970s had accumulated a long and documented experience of its relationship with the San Francisco Police Department, and that relationship was not one that would have encouraged its members to call a police tip line. The composite sketch was circulated. It did not produce what investigators needed. Those two facts are connected, and the connection between them is the history of how the SFPD had treated gay men in the city for years before the Doodler investigation began. The documented history of police conduct toward gay men in San Francisco is not incidental to how the investigation proceeded. It is the context without which the investigation's limits cannot be understood. The SFPD had conducted entrapment operations in the bars and parks where gay men gathered, deploying undercover officers to initiate contact and then arrest the men who responded. Officers had used the sodomy statute, which remained in California law until 1975, as both legal justification and operational tool. Gay men had been subjected to public arrests, to the exposure of their names in court records, to the systematic use of law enforcement presence as a form of harassment rather than protection. These are documented facts in the history of that city and that department during that period. They are not allegations or contested claims. They are the conditions under which Guilford was attempting to investigate a series of murders in a community that had no structural reason to trust him or the institution he represented. Guilford understood this. The investigators who worked the case understood it. The distance between the gay community and the department that was supposed to be investigating crimes against its members was not something they could close by virtue of individual goodwill or the sincerity of their intentions. The mistrust had been built over years through documented actions, and it operated as a structural barrier that shaped what witnesses would say, who would come forward, and how much information would reach the people who might have been able to use it. The investigation proceeded inside that barrier, not around it. What Guilford's investigation ultimately produced was an identification. Investigators came to believe they knew who the Doodler was. A specific individual was identified as the likely suspect. According to what has been reported about the investigation, that person was interviewed. The interview happened. The suspect, who is not named here, because no charges have ever been filed and no legal conclusion has ever been reached, was brought to the attention of investigators. Not through physical evidence alone, but through the accumulated information from witnesses who had encountered him and survived, and from the documented pattern of the case itself. The identification represented real investigative work. It represented months of effort under difficult conditions by investigators who had built something tangible from the fragments available to them. The case was then presented to the San Francisco District Attorney's Office. What the District Attorney's Office found, on review of the investigative record, was not a case that could be prosecuted. The decision not to file charges was not a finding of innocence. It was not a verdict. It was an administrative and prosecutorial determination that the case as it stood could not be brought to trial because the evidence structure that supported it was not the kind that could survive the requirements of criminal prosecution. The case rested on survivor testimony. It rested on the accounts of men who had encountered the suspect and could speak to what they had witnessed. Those men had made clear, in documented terms, that they would not testify in any public proceeding. They would not participate in a trial. They would not appear in court. The reasons for that refusal were not capricious, and they were not failures of courage. They were the rational decisions of men who had been placed in an impossible position by the legal and social conditions of the world they were living in, and who understood exactly what public testimony would cost them in concrete, practical terms. Without witnesses who would testify, the case could not proceed. That is not a novel legal situation, and it does not require a special explanation. Criminal prosecution requires evidence that can be presented and examined. It requires witnesses who can be called and cross-examined. The district attorney's office looked at what Guilford's investigation had built and concluded that what was there was not sufficient to bring to trial, that the witnesses on whom the case would rest had definitively declined to participate, and that filing charges under those circumstances was not viable. The file remained open. The suspect remained free. The investigation went quiet, not closed, but quiet. The particular quiet of a case that has reached the boundary of what the system has the tools to do and has stopped there. There is a distinction worth following carefully here. The case did not go cold because investigators gave up on it, or because no one had done the work, or because the murders were treated as unimportant and assigned to the back of a drawer somewhere in the early months of the investigation. Guilford had done the work. The witnesses had cooperated to the extent they were willing and able to cooperate. A suspect had been identified. The identification had been developed enough that the district attorney's office had something real in front of it when it made its decision. The case went quiet because the law as it existed in that moment and the social conditions that surrounded it had produced a situation in which the people who knew the most could not safely say what they knew in a setting where what they said would have any legal force. That is the shape of the limit the investigation reached, and it is a shape produced by something larger than the investigation itself. The composite sketch remained. It had been printed and circulated, and it existed in the archives of whatever San Francisco media outlets had reproduced it in 1975, and in the files of the SFPD, and in the memory of people who had seen it. It depicted a face. The face it depicted had been described to police artists by people who had seen it in the soft, warm interior light of a bar on Polk Street, or across the surface of a table in a late-night diner, or in the particular intimacy of a moment when someone was watching their own likeness appear on a piece of paper. The composite was not a photograph. Composite illustrations from this era were rendered approximations, built from description, shaped by the conventions and limitations of police illustration as it was practiced in the mid-1970s. What the sketch showed was as close as the investigative record could come, through graphic means, to the face of the person Guilford's investigation was looking for. The sketch had been circulated into a community that did not fully trust the institution circulating it. That is a documented fact about the investigation's context, and it is part of the explanation for why a circulated composite of a suspect in a series of murders, reproduced in local newspapers, generated limited actionable response. It was not that the sketch was invisible, or that no one who might have recognized the face saw it. It was that the conditions under which someone who recognized that face might have picked up a phone and called a detective were conditions that the SFPD had spent years making inhospitable. The composite existed, it circulated, it reached people. What happened to the recognition it may have produced is part of what the investigative record does not contain, because the recognition, if it existed, did not travel from the person who experienced it to the people who needed to know about it. Guilford continued working the case. The files continued accumulating. Months passed after the district attorney's decision, and the investigation maintained a presence in the department's active caseload without producing new developments that could change the fundamental structure of the problem. The murders appeared to have ceased in September 1975. That is what the timeline shows, based on the documented pattern of victim discoveries and the behavioral signature that had connected the cases. Whether the cessation meant anything specific, whether it represented a choice or a circumstance, or something else entirely, is not something the record establishes. The killings stopped. The investigation continued, and then became quieter, and then became the kind of matter that persists in a department's records as something unresolved rather than something active. Physical evidence from the crime scenes had been collected and preserved. The sites along Ocean Beach where victims had been found had been processed by investigators, and what could be gathered from those locations had been gathered. This was coastal outdoor terrain, sand, salt air, the particular environmental conditions of a Pacific beachfront, in the nights and early mornings when the discoveries were made. The forensic science available to investigators in 1974 and 1975 was not what it would become in subsequent decades. DNA analysis as a forensic tool did not yet exist in any usable sense. The techniques available to the SFPD for connecting physical evidence from a crime scene to a specific individual were the techniques of their era: typed blood, hair analysis, fingerprint comparison, and the challenges of evidence preservation in a coastal outdoor environment compounded the limitations of what those techniques could establish. Physical materials were collected from the beach sites. They were cataloged and preserved according to the procedures in use at the time. They went into SFPD evidence storage, sealed and labeled, held in the institutional custody of a department that did not yet have the means to make full use of what it had. Evidence storage is a mundane thing. It is shelving in sealed containers in an organizational system built around the possibility that something held today will be needed tomorrow, or in a year, or in 20 years. The evidence from the Ocean Beach crime scenes occupied some portion of that system From the mid-1970s forward, the bags and containers held what they held, material collected from sand, from the coastal perimeter, from specific locations that investigators had documented and mapped as part of the case record. The labels on those containers named the case. They named the date of collection and the location and the evidence number. They did not name a suspect because at the time of collection the suspect was not yet identified, and by the time a suspect had been identified, the investigation had reached the boundary that it could not cross. The evidence waited in the way that physical objects wait, without awareness, without urgency, without any property beyond persistence. The case file grew. It was not filed away definitively as closed because the case was not closed. Under California law, murder carries no statute of limitations, and the murders attributed to the Doodler remained open criminal matters, regardless of how long had passed since they were committed. That legal fact had a procedural consequence. The files stayed in the system as a live matter. It accumulated additional documentation as the investigation produced new interviews, new reviews, new assessments of what had already been gathered. The file's physical weight increased over years. The number of pages grew. The record became longer. What it contained, the witness accounts, the composite sketch, the documented victim connections, the evidence cataloging, the identification of a suspect, the district attorney's determination, remained present in the file as it grew, each layer of subsequent documentation sitting on top of the layer that preceded it. Rota Guilford's name is attached to this investigation in the historical record as the lead investigator, and that attachment is a form of documentation as well. He worked the case in an era when the structural obstacles in front of it were not incidental challenges, but constitutive conditions, conditions produced by law, by institutional history, by the specific shape of the relationship between a police department and the community it was supposedly protecting. He identified a suspect. He developed an investigative record, substantive enough to bring to the district attorney's office. He did not solve the case in the sense that the word is usually understood, because solving a case in that sense requires the cooperation of systems that were not in 1975 prepared to cooperate. What he built was the foundation of the record that subsequent investigators would return to. What he left was a file with a name in it, and evidence in storage, and the documented shape of an investigation that had reached the boundary of its moment. The community the Doodler had moved through was not, during this period, without political voice or organizational capacity. The mid-1970s in San Francisco were a time of rapid change in how the city's gay community positioned itself in public life. New organizations, new political figures, a new geography of visible presence in certain neighborhoods. That context was simultaneously the context in which the Doodler had operated. The bars and diners where he had sat and drawn were part of a world that was changing, that was asserting itself, that was becoming something different from what it had been a decade before. The murders had occurred inside that transformation. The investigation had run alongside it. The two things, the political emergence of a community and the killings occurring within it, had existed in the same city at the same time, and the relationship between them had shaped how the case was investigated, how it was reported, and how limited a footprint it left in the mainstream public record of the period. Media coverage of the murders had been minimal. The victims, who were gay men, had not attracted the sustained attention from mainstream press that a comparable series of murders might have attracted if the victims had belonged to a different community. This is a documented pattern in the case's history, and not a contested one. The marginalization that had made the Doodler's victims more isolated in death also made them less visible in the news record. The composite sketch had run in local papers, but the case had not become the subject of extended investigative journalism or the kind of sustained public attention that sometimes produces tips and leads through sheer volume of eyes on a published image. The case existed at a frequency that the broader public did not tune to, not because it was hidden, but because the apparatus of mainstream attention was not directed toward it. The investigators who worked alongside Guilford carried this with them through the years. The case remained active. The files sat in the department. The evidence sat in storage. The suspect whose name was in the file continued to exist in the world, so far as was known, at a distance from any legal consequence. The case did not produce a resolution. It produced a record, a detailed, careful, painstaking record of what investigators had found and who they believed was responsible. And that record was not the same thing as the resolution it pointed toward but could not reach. There is a quality to cases that stop at this particular boundary, cases where the work was done, where the investigation produced a result, where the result was real and documented and shared with the people who had the authority to act on it, and where that act did not follow. The quality is not quite failure and not quite success. It is something more like a sentence that ends before its final word, the grammatical structure present, the direction clear, the completion absent. The Doodler investigation had the shape of a completed investigation. It had identified a suspect. It had built a body of evidence. It had brought that body of evidence to the appropriate authority. What it lacked at the specific point where prosecution would have required it was the cooperation of witnesses in circumstances that made their cooperation functionally impossible. The file recorded all of this with the documentary evenness of a system that records what happens without rendering judgment on it. The composite sketch of the Doodler, reproduced in 1975 in San Francisco newsprint, depicted a specific face. That face had been described by people who had seen it, and those descriptions had been translated by a police artist into lines on paper. The sketch was not a photograph, and composite illustrations carry their own limitations as identifications. They reflect the memory of witnesses, the conventions of the illustrator, and the technology of translation between verbal description and graphic representation. What the composite showed was the investigator's best approximation, in the graphic language available to them, of the face they were looking for. It was specific enough to constitute a real investigative tool. It was not specific enough, or was not circulated into the right conditions, to produce the result that would have mattered. Inspector Guilford's investigation had found what it could find. The district attorney's office had reviewed it and made the determination it made. The evidence had been preserved and cataloged and stored. The file had been kept open because under California law it had to be. The case had become a quiet presence in the department's records, not forgotten, not resolved, present in the way that open cases are present in the systems that hold them. The Doodler's name and the name of the person investigators believed the Doodler to be both resided in that file, in a building in San Francisco, while the years that had accumulated since January 1974 continued to accumulate further. The Ocean Beach crime scenes were, by the later 1970s, long-cleared locations on a stretch of Pacific coastline that predated the investigation and would outlast it. The sand shifted, the surf continued, the physical geography of the place changed in the incremental ways that coastal terrain changes, wind and water and season, the particular impermanence of a beach as a surface. The documentary record of what had been found at those locations was preserved in the files. The coordinates and descriptions and documented findings were held in paper form in the SFPD records and in the sealed containers in evidence storage. and in the memories of the investigators who had worked those sites. The beach itself held nothing. The record held everything the investigation had managed to capture. The evidence in storage, the physical materials collected from those coastal sites in 1974 and 1975, was held in the way all evidence is held, shelved and sealed and cataloged and waiting. It had been collected at a time when the technology that might eventually be applied to it did not exist, when the forensic science of the mid-1970s could do only what the mid-1970s forensic science could do, which was not enough to close the gap between an identified suspect and a viable prosecution. The materials in those evidence bags were real. They were physical. They were the actual substance of what had been present at the crime scenes, gathered from sand, labeled in sequence, checked into the system that keeps such things. They did not deteriorate in the way that memory deteriorates. They were there in the particular preserved stillness of a sealed container in a temperature-regulated room, holding what they held, exactly as they had when they were gathered. The case file on the Doodler, as it existed through the later years of the investigation's quiet period, was a physical accumulation of paper, reports and witness statements, and evidence logs, and the documentation of the district attorney's decision, and the composite sketch reproduction, and the timeline of victim discoveries, and the correspondence between investigators, and the records of what had been found and what had not. It was the material form of everything the investigation had done. It was also the material form of the limits the investigation had encountered, the gap between what was in the file and what the file could not contain, because the testimony that would have completed it had never been given in a form that the system could use. That gap is documented in the file as well, in the indirect way that absences are documented, the witness accounts that stop short of usable testimony, the district attorney's decision recorded as a determination rather than a dismissal, the ongoing open status of a case that cannot formally be closed. The file records the shape of what is not in it. The record includes, in its own way, the record of its incompleteness. That is not an unusual quality in a case file. Most investigations document not only what was found, but what remained outside the reach of what was found. In this case, the documentation of that outside was particularly legible, because the gap was not forensic or temporal, but social and legal, produced by conditions that the investigation itself had named and traced and could not change. Guilford had named those conditions. He had worked inside them with the care of someone who understood that care was what he had in the absence of the structural cooperation that the investigation could not compel. He had built the record. He had brought it as far as it could go within the constraints of the moment it was built in. The file carried his name and his work and the documented evidence of what that work had found, and the file stayed open in the system that holds open cases, waiting with the particular patience of paper and sealed containers and an evidence log that had not changed since the materials were checked in. The physical evidence from Ocean Beach sat in SFPD storage through the years that the investigation went quiet, sealed, cataloged, the labels still readable, written in whatever hand had filled them out in 1974 or 1975 by whoever had processed the evidence at the time of collection. The containers held what had been gathered from the sand and the coastal perimeter of those crime scenes, and they held it with the specific fidelity of sealed physical preservation, unchanged, patient, present in the building where they had been placed. Through the years that followed and the decades that followed after that, the record of something real and documented and not yet finished. In California, in 1974, a specific law remained on the books. It was not abstract, it was not symbolic, It was a provision of the California Penal Code that classified consensual sexual acts between adults of the same sex as a criminal offense, a felony in some applications, and its presence in the legal code was not incidental to what happened in San Francisco that year and the year that followed. It was structural. It shaped, in documented and concrete ways, the decisions made by every person who encountered the investigation and chose how much to give it. The law existed alongside the murders. It existed alongside the survivors who sat across from detectives and answered questions carefully, knowing that the answers could only go so far before they became a different kind of confession. It existed alongside the victims who could not speak for themselves and whose deaths accumulated in the case files of the San Francisco Police Department through 1974 and into 1975, linked by a behavioral signature and a geography and a name that investigators gave the case, a name drawn from the specific documented habit of a young man who carried a sketch pad into bars and drew the faces of strangers. The sodomy statute was not a thing apart from those deaths. The statute was part of the structure that held those deaths in place, that kept them quieter than they might otherwise have been, that made the question of who would speak and who would not speak a question with a particular and documented answer. California repealed that statute in 1975. The law was gone by the time the murders appear to have ceased, and the coincidence of those two dates, the repeal and the quiet that followed the last attributed killing in September of that year, is one of those facts the record holds without explanation. The repeal did not undo what the law had already shaped. The survivors who had chosen silence had made their choices inside a legal reality that had already formed them, and the repeal could not reach backward into those interview rooms in SFPD buildings and change what had been said and what had been withheld. The law was gone, and what it had already done remained. The community in which the Doodler's victims lived and moved and were known was not static during those years. The mid-1970s in San Francisco were a period of documented and visible transformation for the city's gay community, and the geography of that transformation was specific. The Castro district, a neighborhood whose streets were already beginning to take on the particular character they would carry into the decades that followed, was changing. Storefronts were opening, signs were appearing in windows. The sidewalks of the Castro held a different quality of occupation than they had a decade before, a more public presence, a more organized one, the visible expression of a community that was learning to represent itself in daylight and in language and in political form. Harvey Milk was among the figures who emerged from that moment. His name appears in the documented record of 1970s San Francisco as a shopkeeper, as a candidate, as a man who ran for public office repeatedly before winning a seat on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors in 1977. He was part of the specific social world that the Castro district held during those years, a world that was gaining political voice and public visibility at the same time that the Doodler was moving through the bars and diners of Polk Street, a few neighborhoods to the north. These two things existed simultaneously in the same city. The community that was forming and speaking and organizing was also, in documented fact, the community whose members were being found on the beach and in the park and along the paths that ran through the western edge of the city. The Castro and Polk Gulch were not far from each other. In the particular geography of San Francisco, where neighborhoods compress and shift within short distances, the distance between them was walkable. The men who moved through Polk Street venues in 1974 and 1975 were part of the same broad social world that was taking shape in the Castro, even if the specific character of the two neighborhoods differed. What the record holds is that these were not separate communities experiencing separate things. They were part of a single complicated moment, a community becoming more visible and more politically organized, while simultaneously being targeted, while simultaneously being failed by institutions that had spent years treating its members as criminals rather than as citizens. The SFPD composite sketch of the Doodler suspect, released in 1975, circulated through local media. It depicted a young black man with specific described facial features, rendered in the characteristic style of police composite illustration, and reproduced in newsprint. The sketch reached people, it was seen, and the community it was released into was a community with documented reasons to receive law enforcement overtures with caution, reasons that had accumulated over years of entrapment operations and raids, and the particular kind of institutional violence that does not always appear in any single dramatic incident, but that builds over time into a documented structural reality. The sketch existed inside that reality. Its limited yield, in terms of actionable public response, was not incidental to that reality. It was a direct product of it. By 1975, the investigation had produced a named suspect. Inspector Rotea Guilford's work had moved the case from a pattern of deaths to an identified individual, a specific person whose name was known to the SFPD, who had reportedly been interviewed, who existed in the case file not as a composite or a theory, but as a named and documented subject of investigative attention. What the investigation had not produced, and what the documented record shows it could not produce given the conditions under which it operated, was a set of witnesses willing to testify publicly. The San Francisco District Attorney reviewed the case and declined to file charges. The reasoning was procedural. Without witnesses who would appear and speak in open proceedings, the case as it stood could not sustain a prosecution. This was not a conclusion about guilt or innocence. It was an administrative determination about what the available evidence could and could not do under the legal standards that governed it. The named suspect's name did not appear in a courtroom. It did not appear in formal legal proceedings. It remained where it was, in the case file, in the investigative record, held by the SFPD in the specific form of documented knowledge that never became public knowledge in the way that a conviction or even a formal charge would have made it. Time passed in the way that time passes in cold cases, not in a single dramatic interval, but in the quieter accumulation of years, during which the file was not closed, but also not actively pursued, during which the city changed, and the neighborhood changed, and the people who had been in those bars and diners in 1974 and 1975 grew older or moved away or died, during which the forensic science available to investigators developed in ways that 1970s technology could not have anticipated. The evidence from the Ocean Beach crime scenes had been collected and preserved. Physical materials from those scenes were cataloged in the mid-1970s and held in SFPD evidence storage, sealed and labeled and maintained against the possibility, however distant it may have seemed, that a future analysis might be able to do what 1970s methods could not. Evidence preservation in a coastal outdoor environment presents specific challenges. The beach is not a controlled space. Wind and water and the particular physical character of sand do not cooperate with the requirements of forensic collection in the way that an interior space might. What the investigators collected from those scenes in 1974 and 1975 was collected under those conditions, with those constraints, and preserved in whatever form the collection had produced. The fact that it was preserved at all, that the SFPD held it in its evidence system through the decades that followed, is itself a documented fact worth holding. Around 2019, the San Francisco Police Department's Cold Case Unit formally reopened the Doodler investigation. The reopening was public. The SFPD acknowledged the case and its history in explicit terms, naming the investigation and framing its revival as both a law enforcement matter and a recognition of the particular injustice that had shaped the original investigation's outcome. This was not a quiet administrative action. It was a public statement that the case remained open as a live criminal matter and that the department intended to pursue it with the tools that the intervening decades had made available. The reopening brought the case's history into a different kind of light. People who had been children or young adults during the mid-1970s could now read accounts of the investigation and understand it in a context that the 1970s had not made available, a context in which the decision not to prosecute, the silence of the survivors, the community's distance from law enforcement could be named plainly for what they were. The social and legal conditions that had shaped those decisions could be identified and described. The specific way in which California's sodomy statute had functioned as a barrier between victims and the institutions that might have helped them could be stated as a historical fact rather than implied or elided. As part of the revived investigation, forensic analysts began re-examining the physical evidence from the original crime scenes using modern DNA analysis techniques. The science available in 2019 bore no practical resemblance to what had existed in 1974. Genetic material that would have been invisible or unreadable to 1970s methods could now be identified, sequenced, and potentially matched against databases that did not exist when the evidence was first collected. The specific results of that testing, as of the most recent documented reporting, have not been publicly disclosed. What is confirmed is that the testing was undertaken, that the sealed materials from Ocean Beach crime scenes were brought out of storage and subjected to analysis of a kind that was not available when they were first collected and sealed away. The absence of a public result is not the same as an absence of a result. It means only that whatever the analysis produced has not entered the public record in a form that can be reported as confirmed fact. The case file remains open, the investigation remains live, the materials remain in the evidence system. What the analysis found or did not find is held within the investigative record in the specific form of information that has not yet moved from there to here. California has no statute of limitations for murder. This is a confirmed provision of the state's law, a specific legal text establishing that the passage of time does not in itself close the possibility of prosecution for a homicide. The 50 years that have elapsed since the first of the Doodler's attributed killings do not function, under California law, as a legal barrier to charging someone for those killings. If the Doodler were identified today, if the evidence were sufficient, and the witnesses or forensic material were available to support a prosecution, the charges would not be barred by the calendar. The case is open not as a formality or as a historical designation. It is open in the specific legal sense that a prosecution remains possible. The SFPD case file on the Doodler exists today in whatever form the department maintains its records, physical folders, digital scans, the accumulated paper of an investigation that began in 1974 and has not been formally closed. The file contains the composite sketch released in 1975. It contains the witness statements taken in the mid-1970s, the accounts given in those interview rooms by people who spoke carefully and within limits. It contains the investigative record assembled by Inspector Rotea Guilford, whose work produced a named suspect despite the structural obstacles that prevented that name from ever becoming a matter of public legal record. It contains the evidence catalog from the Ocean Beach crime scenes, the list of materials collected in 1974 and 1975, and held in the evidence system through everything that has come since. The file holds the name that was never spoken in a courtroom. There is something particular about the way a case file accumulates across 50 years. It does not grow in a straight line. It grows in bursts, a period of intensive documentation, followed by quiet, followed by a renewed burst of activity when investigators return to it, followed by another interval of quiet. Each return adds something to the file, a new report, a re-interview, a forensic result, a note that the case remains open and active and assigned. The file thickens. The pages from the 1970s, their paper now 50 years old, sit alongside documents produced decades later. The original investigative materials and the modern forensic reports occupy the same folder or the same digital record, and together they make a single thing, a document of an investigation that is not finished. The victims named in that file were real people. They moved through a specific city in a specific decade, using the bars and diners and social spaces available to them in the particular social world of mid-1970s San Francisco. They were part of a community that was simultaneously making itself more visible and less protected than visibility might suggest. A community gaining political form while living under laws that classified its most private life as criminal, while navigating institutions that had spent years treating its members as targets rather than as the public. Those institutions existed to serve. The victim's marginalized status is documented. The way that status functioned to reduce law enforcement urgency and limit mainstream media attention is documented. These are facts about the investigation, not characterizations. They belong to the record alongside the forensic findings and the witness statements and the composite sketch. What has not been resolved in 50 years is the fundamental question the case was built around. The name in the file has not been attached to a conviction. The suspect who was interviewed in the mid-1970s was not charged. The evidence has been preserved and re-examined, and whatever that re-examination produced is held within the investigative record rather than the public one. The case is still open. The file is still there. The question that the investigation assembled around a specific pattern of deaths in 1974 and 1975 is still, formally and in documented fact, unanswered. The western edge of San Francisco is still there. Ocean Beach runs along it, the wide flat strip of Pacific coastline where the city meets the water, where the sand stretches south toward the city's edge and north toward the Marin headlands across the bay. The beach does not hold what happened on it. It is a beach. People walk on it in the mornings and in the evenings and stand at the water's edge in the particular San Francisco way, watching the fog come in from the Pacific or watching it thin and pull back to reveal the ocean underneath. The paths through the western edge of Golden Gate Park are still paths. Pace Rate is still a street. The specific geography of the investigation is still physically present. The same locations, the same distances between them, the same relationship between the social spaces of the Polk Gulch corridor and the more isolated terrain to the west, where in the documented record some of what happened was found. This is one of the things that cold cases hold that other kinds of stories do not. The places remain, the files remain, the questions remain in the specific form they took when the investigation first assembled them, shaped by the materials available at the time and the conditions under which those materials were gathered. Time does not dissolve these things. it accumulates around them. The investigation that began in 1974 and went quiet and was reopened in 2019 is still the same investigation, carrying the same original documents, asking questions that were first asked 50 years ago, holding a name that has been in the file since a decade, when that name was not enough. There is a quality to the particular kind of record that a cold case produces. It is not the record of something that was resolved and then looked back upon. It is the record of something that is still in process, still being assembled, still being examined, still holding open the possibility that the next review, or the next forensic result, or the next witness willing to speak will move it forward in some way. The Doodler case has that quality. It has had it since 1975, when the murders appear to have ceased and the investigation went quiet without reaching a conclusion. It had it through the decades of relative dormancy that followed. It had it when the cold case unit formally reopened the investigation and began working through the preserved evidence with tools that did not exist when the evidence was first collected. It has it now. The Castro district has changed considerably since the mid-1970s. The neighborhood that was forming and becoming more organized and more publicly visible during the years the Doodler was active has had 50 years of subsequent history. The people who walked those streets in 1974 and 1975, who were part of the community that was simultaneously becoming more visible and being targeted, who made the specific decisions they made about what to say and what not to say in interview rooms in SFPD buildings, those people are now 50 years older, or they are not alive. The city they moved through has changed in specific and documented ways. The legal framework has changed. California's sodomy statute was repealed. Homosexuality was declassified as a disorder by the American Psychiatric Association in 1973, a reclassification whose effects moved slowly through the institutions that had operated according to the previous classification. The relationship between San Francisco's gay community and the SFPD has a different character now than it had in 1975, though the history that produced the 1975 relationship is part of the record and cannot be undone by subsequent improvement. What remained constant through all of that change is the file. The case was not closed. The evidence was not destroyed. The name was not removed from the investigative record. The physical materials from Ocean Beach were held. Inspector Guilford's work was preserved in the form of the documentation he produced. The witness statements, the investigative conclusions, the identified suspect, the case built as far as it could be built within the constraints that the time and the circumstances placed around it. All of that remained. The cold case unit that reopened the investigation in 2019 had access to what Guilford's investigation had produced, and they had access to methods that Guilford's investigation could not have employed. The two things together, the 1970s record and the modern forensic capacity, are what the current investigation consists of. The forensic evidence held in SFPD storage represents a specific kind of preserved possibility. Evidence collected from outdoor crime scenes in 1974 and 1975 under the conditions that Ocean Beach presents, and held for 50 years in whatever form the collection produced. This is not evidence in ideal condition. The passage of time and the character of the original collection site impose real limitations on what modern analysis can do with what was preserved. And yet the analysis was undertaken. The materials were brought out of storage and examined. The results, whatever they are, exist somewhere in the investigative record. It is worth staying with that image for a moment, not as a source of anticipation or urgency, but simply as a factual image. Sealed containers on shelving in a storage facility, labels still legible after 50 years, contents still present in whatever form they took when they were collected and sealed. The ordinary-looking physical form of preserved evidence, which is also the physical form of a question that has been held open across 5 decades. That is what the evidence represents. It is material collected in 1974 and 1975 from a beach on the western edge of San Francisco, held in a building somewhere in the city, in the specific material form of something that was gathered under difficult conditions and preserved against the possibility of a future that the people doing the preserving could not have fully anticipated. The case does not resolve at the end of the most recent account of it. The reopened investigation does not have a public result to point to. The forensic re-examination has not produced a disclosed finding that moved the case to a close. The suspect named in the 1970s file has not been charged. The file remains open in the same formal sense that it has remained open since 1975, actively in the specific legal meaning of a live criminal matter under California law, which does not apply a statute of limitations to murder and therefore does not recognize the passage of time as a reason to stop. What the record holds in its most recent documented form is a case opened in 1974, an investigation that identified a suspect without achieving a prosecution, a period of dormancy, a formal reopening in 2019, a re-examination of preserved forensic evidence, and an ongoing status of open. These are the documented facts of where the case stands. Nothing beyond these documented facts belongs in the record, as it can be honestly narrated. There is a particular quality to sitting with a case like this one, at this hour, in the specific kind of attention that a long narration produces, a quality that is not urgency, and not dread, and not resolution, but something closer to the feeling of having followed a careful account of something real, all the way to the edge of what is currently known. The edge of what is currently known, in the Doodler case, is a specific and documentable place. It is 2019 roughly, and an investigation formally reopened. It is forensic evidence being re-examined with tools that did not exist in 1974. It is a case file still marked open in the SFPD's records. It is a name in a file that has never been spoken in a courtroom. It is California law, which says that if the evidence were there and the witness is willing, the charges could still be filed. That 50 years is not too long, not under the law that governs this case. Beyond that edge, there is what is not known, what the forensic analysis produced, whether the suspect is alive, what the cold case unit has found that has not entered the public record.